Every day, the sun rises across the world's highest and most dangerous mountain. Covered in snow, looming in the distance, it is the greatest climbing challenge in the world. Until the 1950s, it was thought that nobody could possibly reach the top of this monolithic peak. Depleted oxygen levels, freezing conditions and harsh winds meant that this was simply a place of fairy tale and folklore. But in 1953, one man would change all that. On the 29th of May, Sir Edmund Percival Hillary, accompanied by Sherpa mountaineer Tenzing Norgay, reached the highest point in the world, the summit of Mount Everest. The pair were treated to a hero's welcome after their return. Their mission had previously been thought impossible, but the pair had proved that their mission was achievable.
They're very happy.
But for Sir Edmund Hillary, reaching his goal of climbing Mount Everest, something which nobody else in the world had done before him, was not enough. Hillary dedicated his time to the Nepalese communities that had helped him reach his goal. Hillary founded the Himalaya Trust and built schools and hospitals in the area. Thanks to Hillary's work, children could become educated in the far reaches of Nepal and find medical treatment that was previously unavailable. Although Hillary has been honoured for his work and even made an honorary citizen of Nepal, he still thanks the country for what it gave him and the extraordinary life that Nepal helped him lead.
And we say our thanks to you and our thanks to Nepal. We undoubtedly felt great satisfaction from being able to overcome these challenges.
The climb to the top of Mount Everest is arguably the most difficult journey in the world. Reaching 29,000 feet, Mount Everest is a challenge of monolithic proportions. Climbers face altitude sickness, freezing conditions and gale force winds. At the end of 2009, 216 hopeful climbers had died on its icy slopes. Their bodies left where they fell. If there is one group of people who know the mountain better than anybody else in the world, it is Nepal's Sherpa people. Living in the Himalayas, the Sherpa people grow up in high altitude, surrounded by the imposing mountain ranges. They follow a Buddhist way of life and live on crops grown at high altitude. The Sherpas believe that every mountain, forest and cave is inhabited by gods and demons, and they named the looming Mount Everest the Mother of the World. When Tenzing Norgay reached the summit of Mount Everest, he left chocolates on top of the mountain as an offering to the gods. The Sherpa people are renowned in the international climbing and mountaineering community. Their hardiness, expertise and experience mean that nobody should attempt a climb to the top of Everest without a Sherpa as a guide. Because of this, the term Sherpa has even become synonymous with guide. It is rumoured that the Sherpa people are genetically adapted to climbing. Unique hemoglobin-binding enzymes, doubled nitric oxide production, hearts that can utilise glucose, and lungs with an increased sensitivity to low oxygen mean that they are suited to the high altitudes. In 2003, two Sherpas competed to see who could reach the summit of Mount Everest in the shortest time. One completed the task in 12 hours, the other in 10. However, Tenzing Norgay is still the best-known Sherpa. Before he accompanied Edmund Hillary on his record-breaking climb, Norgay had been a porter on Everest expedition since the 1930s. He has now been listed by Time magazine as one of the most influential people of all time. The allure and relative ease of summiting Mount Everest today has brought economic growth to this isolated part of the world. Aspiring climbers must pay a government fee of up to $25,000 to be allowed their attempt at climbing the mountain. In 1953, an expedition involving 400 people and 10,000 pounds of baggage set out to summit Mount Everest. Edmund Hillary and Sherpa Tenzing Norgay were one of two selected teams to climb to the top. The first team turned around 300 feet from the summit due to oxygen failure. At 27,900 feet, Hillary and Norgay were alone. The pair reached the summit after ascending the 40-foot climb, now known as Hillary's Step. Hillary, who had turned off his oxygen to prove that one could survive without it, claims he did not feel excited as his sensations and vision were too dulled. Coming back down the mountain, Hillary announced to his friend, George Lowe, "Well, George, we knocked the bastard off." There is only one photo from the top of Everest, an image of Tenzing Norgay on his own. Norgay had never used a camera before and was unable to operate it to take a photo of Hillary. Hillary and Norgay enjoyed their hero's welcome back at base camp. The news of their success was announced on the same day as the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, and the public thought of it as a coronation gift. Hillary embarked on a lecture tour where he recounted the summit experience to a captive audience. Hillary was an overnight star.
Well, I think personally my main one was a relief that we got there. But after that I think we were fairly pleased about it. But all our sensations due to the lack of oxygen were, I think, rather dull. I was leading down the icefall, and when I was crossing a crevasse, a large lump of ice gave way on which I was standing, and I set off down a crevasse. Well, Tenzing, who was following, had the rope tight in a very short time and pulled me up, so I didn't go very far, and I managed to get out all right.
Hillary and expedition leader John Hunt both received the Hubbard Medal from President Eisenhower. Hillary had come a long way since his days as a beekeeper in New Zealand. Officials from Canada gave Hillary a sleeping bag, like the one used during the climb.
Although, as you say, the only actual piece of equipment that I know of that came from Canada was the sleeping bags, they certainly did a magnificent task, as on the mountain approximately 60 or 70% of your time is actually spent in your sleeping bag, so you do become rather attached to it.
Although he had conquered Everest, the insatiable Hillary was keen to explore another uncharted part of the world. In 1958, Edmund Hillary set out on another expedition, this time to Antarctica. He led the New Zealand section, and his party were the first to reach the pole using motor vehicles. Growing up in New Zealand and originally going into the family beekeeping business, Hillary had always been attracted to a life of adventure. He made his first major climb, reaching the summit of Mount Everest in 1939. He then served as a navigator during World War II, before climbing other mountains, leading up to his impressive assault on Everest. Hillary's other journeys included a flight with Neil Armstrong to the North Pole, after which he became the first man to have stood at both poles and the summit of Mount Everest. Despite his further adventures, Hillary remained loyal to Nepal. His foundation, the Himalayan Trust, built schools and hospitals across the region. But Nepal would grow close to his heart for more than one reason. It was the place he lost his wife and daughter. In 1979, while working to build a hospital, Hillary's wife Louise and their daughter Belinda were killed in a plane crash near Kathmandu. As part of the 2003 celebrations to mark the 50th anniversary of Hillary's ascent, his son Peter, as well as Jamling Norgay, the son of Tenzing, also summited Mount Everest.
And we say our thanks to you and our thanks to Nepal for your warmth and your generosity.
Many people, they are educated because of Sir N. Otherwise, that would not have been possible.
Edmund Hillary addressed the gathering of the people and asked one question: what do you want? Then the answer was, we need a school for our school children. Because our children have eyes, but they cannot see, because education is the most important thing.
In recognition for his work in Nepal, Hillary was made an honorary citizen of the country. Other awards for his work include the KBE, Order of New Zealand and the Polar Medal. He was also a lifelong patron of the Sir Edmund Hillary Outdoor Pursuit Centre.
If I met Sir Edmund Hillary, I will say thank you for giving us education.
After building schools in the Himalayas, Hillary was noted for his contribution to society and ensuring the traditions of the Sherpa live on. After Hillary summited Everest and brought notoriety to the region, encouraging other climbers to visit, the area became more heavily protected and funded.
In fact, I mean, it was for Sherpa, it was it was a karma for every Sherpa families in the areas, because that was the only opportunity for all Sherpa people to go in a school and had an opportunity to come out from the valley.
It was a very great opportunity because none of my elder sisters and brothers had the opportunity to go to school, and they are illiterate now, even now. And we would be the same as they are now, and now we are really different. Then we had stepped up in a very different lifestyle, and I think this is the result of the opportunity of education I had in coming to school.
The Kandi Hospital enabled sick people in remote areas of the Himalayas to access medical treatment, something which had previously been almost impossible.
Still a big burden of disease and preventable disease, a lot of infectious disease, and because we have antibiotics, because we can diagnose tuberculosis, because we can treat that, it's made a major impact, I think.
Sir Edmund Hillary's contribution to Nepal will never be forgotten. On Mount Everest's North Ridge, the discovery of a water bottle almost changed history. It was thought to belong to George Mallory, a climber who had died trying to summit the mountain. If his bottle had been found on the North Ridge, so near the top of the mountain, did he in fact make it there himself? The question was, did George Mallory reach the top of Mount Everest? And if so, was Edmund Hillary not, in fact, the first man to do so? Mallory had been climbing with fellow mountaineer Andrew Irvine. They set out in 1924, and there has been no recorded proof that they ever reached the summit.
We've speculated that this might mean that he was descending at night. He was not wearing his sunglasses. Tapp Richards recovered this bottle from just below the first step. This is a 1924 bottle. This belonged to either Mallory or Irvine. It's conclusive proof that they were on the Northeast Ridge in 1924.
Other items recovered from the mountain proved that the pair had at least been close to the top.
Whether that means proving conclusively that they reached the summit or that they didn't reach the summit, either outcome would be perfectly acceptable to me. I have no stake in this whatsoever.
He's saying that the Chinese found the body in 75, so what's the big deal in 99?
We think that the Chinese found Irvine.
Whether or not the two climbers reached the summit is one question, but never one to give in easily. Hillary pointed out that half the journey is coming back down again.
So if they now discover that Mallory got there before me, how can I complain? I've had 40 years of being a heroic person. That's not too bad, I can't complain about that. But then I did mention the other factor, which is very important, and that is on a big mountain, there are two aspects to it. One is, of course, that you should successfully reach the summit. The other is that you should successfully get to the bottom again. And who knows, Mallory may have reached the summit, probably he didn't, but he certainly did not reach the bottom.
After Mallory's body was discovered, his clothes were stripped and his body covered with rocks. Everest is littered with the bodies of climbers who did not make it, one of them being schoolteacher David Sharp. Sharp died after reaching the top of the mountain with no oxygen and descending during one of the coldest nights of the year. Double amputee Mark Inglis passed Sharp, who was still breathing, but faced with the difficulty of a nighttime rescue, Inglis's party continued on their journey.
A lot of people have died this year, and a lot of people have suffered injury because they haven't been with a competent team. They haven't been with competent people. I was very fortunate that I was with Russell Bryce, Himalayan Experience, and his Sherpa family.
Sir Edmund Hillary was outspoken in his criticism of the 40 people who passed Sharp. He stated, "I think the whole attitude towards climbing Mount Everest has become rather horrifying. The people just want to get to the top." On January the 11th, 2008, 55 years after making the historic climb, Edmund Hillary died of heart failure.
I think today is important for us as the people of New Zealand because during a lot of our lives, Sir Edmund Hillary has been there quietly working his magic all over the world, and it's my privilege to be part of the generation that will remember him and to pass it on to our children.
At that time, Helen Clark, Prime Minister of New Zealand, stated that his death was a great loss. Sir Edmund Hillary had been afraid of little in his life, and death, he said, was not a frightening prospect. He was a great man who had accomplished a lot and little to regret.
I don't think it particularly frightens me, no. I mean, I had a very long haul. I really had a marvellous life. I've had 2 wonderful wives. You can't do better than that. And no, I've had a very good life and an exciting one.
I'm sure that that work that Ed put in running his Himalayan Trust is something that he'd really like to be remembered for. That is his real legacy.
He'll be remembered as a man of great courage, great heart, humble, graceful, brave guy who showed us how to realize our dreams.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem. We've had a main B bus undervolt, and we had a pretty large bang associated with the caution and warning there.
When Apollo 13 launched in April 1970, it was 9 years since the first manned spaceflight and almost a whole year since the historic moon landing. To the now blasé general public, that momentous day was light years in the past. At Houston, Apollo 13's mission started out so smooth and uneventful. One member of the ground crew wryly joked, "We're bored to tears down here." Soon, they were anything but. On April 13th, a chain of events starting with an electrical component led to a catastrophic explosion in the spaceship's service module and the loss of most of its oxygen supply. The undamaged lunar module, the LEM, was to become the crew's lifeboat and only hope of survival.
Okay, now let's everybody keep cool. We got LEM still attached. The LEM spacecraft's good, so if we need to get back home, we got a LEM to do a good portion of it with.
The pressure in O2 tank 1 is all the way down to 297. We better think about getting in the LEM or using the LEM system.
Apollo 13's service module was crippled at around 320,000 kilometers from Earth. Somehow, the ground crew had to find a way for the 3 astronauts to limp home safely. This was completely uncharted territory, a scenario that had never been imagined, even in the most extreme emergencies they'd simulated. This would test all their ingenuity. In a matter of just hours, they would have to make computations and establish procedures that would normally take months of careful planning. Apollo 13's crew in their LEM lifeboat would have to ration their oxygen, their water, and remain calm and alert if this mission was not to end tragically. The dream of landing man on the moon finally became reality in 1969 with the successful Apollo 11 mission. In the words of pioneering astronaut Neil Armstrong, it was one great leap for mankind. A little under 4 months later, mankind dropped in for a second visit to the moon. Like its predecessor, Apollo 12 collected large quantities of lunar samples, the moon's ancient rocks, providing valuable insight into the development of our solar system. The astronauts also set up an atomic-powered experiments package, comprising equipment to measure seismic activity on the moon, solar wind, and magnetic fields for relay back to Earth. On their homeward journey, the 3 astronauts recorded a sight never seen by mankind, the eclipse of the sun by our own planet. Russia and America both launched satellites as early as the 1950s, and in the following years, increasingly sophisticated measuring equipment gathered atmospheric data, enabling advanced weather forecasting. A global spread of satellites has revolutionized our way of life, with high-speed communications part of everyday living. NASA research was not confined to outer space. Extensive study and testing helped determine the effects of wind turbulence on aircraft, whether caused by other planes or natural forces. Also closer to home, high-altitude photographic surveys were undertaken towards developing remote sensing of natural disasters. The developments that grew out of the space program increasingly affected everyday technologies embraced by people worldwide. As time went by, the intense rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States gradually eased, eventually leading to a more practical, cooperative approach to space exploration. But this was a long time coming. Following several years when both battled the same problems, sought the same solutions, and conducted the same experiments, the difficulty was keeping man alive for several days with limited air, water, and energy, the essentials of life. This would prove to be crucial for the crew in the ill-fated Apollo 13. On April 11th, 1970, Apollo 13's crew prepared for launch. Commander was Jim Lovell, who'd flown 3 earlier missions and orbited the moon on Apollo 8 in 1968. Lunar module pilot was Fred Hayes on his first mission. Piloting the command module was Jack Swaggart, plucked from the backup crew to replace Ken Mattingly, who'd been exposed to German measles and could potentially fall ill.
Auto sequence initiated, flight.
Roger. Flight booster. Go. S4B pre-press complete. Roger.
Flight booster. S1C pre-press complete. We're on internal power and we'll go.
Roger. How's it look, Econ? You got your space?
Looks good, flight.
Okay. MCC record us at flight speed.
Ignition, flight.
Roger. Roger.
Clock start, flight.
Roger.
Thrusters go, all engines.
Roger. Okay, Fido, how's it look?
Looks good here, flight. Good agreement.
Apollo 13 lifted off successfully at 13 hours and 13 minutes. Soon after, the crew felt a small vibration, and the main engine shut down 2 minutes early, although the other 4 engines compensated. Apollo 13 had luck on its side. It was later discovered that the rocket experienced excessive thrust vibrations. Had the engine not shut down, it would probably have ruptured the fuel tanks and Apollo 13 would have exploded. Given the all clear from the ground and unaware how close to tragedy they had come, the crew settled into a routine textbook flight in the combined command service modules, named Odyssey after the science fiction classic.
This little tape recorder has been a big benefit to us in passing some of the time away on our transit out to the moon. And it's rather odd to see it floating like this in Odyssey while it's playing the theme from 2001.
With 572 hours, Commander Lovell had spent more time in space than any human being. In his opinion, this mission was shaping up as the smoothest yet. Now orbiting Earth, the next stage for Apollo 13 was to pull free of Earth's gravity and head towards the moon, using the third and final rocket stage. Once done, Odyssey detached from the rocket, which still housed the lunar module Aquarius. Odyssey rotated 180 degrees, turning upside down to connect or hard dock with the now exposed Aquarius, and pull it free from the rocket to continue the journey to the moon.
This is the crew of Apollo 13, wishing everybody there a nice evening, and we're just about ready to close out our inspection of Aquarius and get back for a pleasant evening at Odyssey. Good night.
13, we've got one more item for you when you get a chance. We'd like it to stir up your cryo tanks. In addition, I have Shaft and Trunnion for a look at the Comet Bennett if you need it.
Okay, stand by.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem. We've had a main B bus undervolt, and we had a pretty large bang associated with the caution and warning there.
Pre-launch, a series of errors had set up an electrical fault in the oxygen tank. When Swaggart switched on its fans, it triggered an electrical spark and a massive explosion. It blew the tank apart, taking out most of Odyssey's power supply. It also blew off an external panel, which clipped the antenna, affecting communications with Earth. Worst of all, Odyssey's oxygen supply was leaking out into space. There was only one option. Aquarius, the lunar module, would have to be their lifeboat.
Here is a bulletin from ABC News. The Apollo 13 spacecraft has had a serious power supply malfunction that could cause the lunar landing mission to be terminated early.
News of the disaster shot around the globe. The space mission, largely ignored by the public that attracted so few viewers to its television coverage, now had everyone's attention. The fate of the astronauts was of concern to all.
Lord, your astronauts will come back safe.
If I may be serious for one moment and ask the entire audience for a moment of prayer for the crewmen of the Apollo 13.
The situation was critical. With its damaged service module and limited power left, Odyssey could not get them all the way home. Aquarius had its own engine and some power, air and water for its time on the moon. But even if it could reach Earth, had no heat shield and would burn up on re-entry. The decision was made to let the moon's gravity carry the command service and the lunar modules around the back of the moon, accelerate and then propel them back towards Earth, a journey of several days.
The position we are now on the Earth-Moon plane, we have to go around the moon to get back if we're going to use the DIPS engine. You would have had enough capability with the SPS engine, but of course we don't dare use that now. So we have to go to the back side of the moon and come back.
This was asking a lot of the lunar module, but at Houston, the LEMS specialists had anticipated its likely role, powering it up quickly, providing a lifeline for the astronauts before it was too late. Now it was a matter of making sure the crew could survive the journey. Aquarius had enough oxygen, but its food and water supplies were meant for 2 men for 2 days. Now it had to carry 3 men for 4 days. It would be a cold, thirsty and uncomfortable journey at best.
I think the LEM spacecraft's in excellent shape, and I think it's fully capable of getting the crew back. I think, as we have found before, every time we've put the LEM spacecraft to a test, it's always done much more than it was guaranteed to do, and I think this is a good case in point.
To remove poisonous carbon dioxide, the crew needed Odyssey's lithium hydroxide, but the canisters were the wrong shape. Ground crew designed an adapter using on-board materials and talked the crew through the process.
We constructed 2 of these things and put them online, and I think within an hour the partial pressure of CO2 was down to 2/10.
Everything had to be conserved in order to last the journey. All non-essential equipment was powered down, and it became extremely cold in the module. Communications were kept to the essentials, although the signal problems caused by the damaged antenna had been overcome. NASA had requested Australia's massive Parkes radio telescope be powered up and brought online, and it now relayed signals between flight control and Apollo. For the astronauts, it was now a waiting game, while the ground crew put all their ingenuity towards the next critical stages.
What we'll be doing till we get them back on the water is concentrating on everything that is their lives are dependent upon at the moment, rather than worrying about the accident, because there's nothing we can do about that now. It appears at the present time that everything is under control and that we have a safe situation at the moment.
Hey, I want to say you guys are doing real good work.
So are you guys, Jack.
As each new situation arose, NASA's ground crews had to make complex manual calculations in a matter of just hours and come up with processes that normally would be tested over several months. A priority was to find a way to get the command module powered up so the crew could return to it, using its precious few hours of remaining power for the rapid descent through Earth's atmosphere. Also critical was deciding where to bring the crew down. This had to be resolved before they went behind the moon, so that their trajectory could be planned to the exact degree. On their present course, they would land in the Indian Ocean, a difficult recovery. The fastest option would bring them into the Atlantic, but also difficult. A slightly longer but safer option was to bring them down in the Pacific, where recovery forces were at hand. This was the chosen course.
The first milestone was to get alignment on the LEM platform. Alignments are important, you know, because without knowing exactly which way the attitude of a spacecraft is in space, there's no way to tell how to burn or how to use the engines of that spacecraft to get the proper trajectory to come home.
due to the large amount of space debris surrounding Apollo 13 since the explosion, it was impossible to get a fix on stars to check the alignment of the spaceship. If they weren't correctly aligned, they could completely overshoot Earth. A mission control member worked out a way to confirm their alignment using the sun. Apollo 13 could now safely make its final burn to re-enter Earth's atmosphere. It was now time to leave Aquarius and return to the powered-up but very cold and damp command module. It was also time to offload the service module, which they had towed all this way to remain in orbit. For the first time, they saw the extent of its damage, where a whole panel had been blown out. Finally, they released Aquarius, a somewhat sad moment as they watched their lifeboat head off to meet its fiery end. On Earth, as Apollo 13 began its descent, people all over anxiously watched and waited, hoping but still fearful.
Odyssey Houston standing by, over.
Okay, go.
Odyssey Houston, we show you on the mains. It really looks great.
Against seemingly impossible odds, the three astronauts, Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swaggart, were back, alive and safe. In Jim Lovell's words, it was a beautiful landing in a blue ink ocean on a lovely, lovely planet. After their 6 days away, the three men were stunned at the reception they received, having no idea of the television and radio coverage, the banner headlines, and that millions of people had cared so much. Deservedly, the cigars came out at Mission Control, where they'd pulled off the impossible. Although they were dehydrated and had lost a lot of weight, the three men were essentially well and remarkably relaxed and composed, as they had been throughout their ordeal. True professionals, every difficult step of the way.
From the start, the exploration of space has been hazardous adventure. The voyage of Apollo 13 dramatized its risks. The men of Apollo 13, by their poise and skill under the most intense kind of pressure, epitomize the character that accepts danger and surmounts it. Theirs is the spirit that built America. Your mission served your country.
Apollo 13's disastrous flight did not spell the end of the space program, as some had predicted. If anything, it bolstered public support, and NASA followed up in 1971 with Apollo 14, which successfully landed in the Fremoro Formation, Apollo 13's mission destination. This 9-day mission was the most extensive ever made, and the crew conducted several experiments. Hundreds of seeds were planted on the moon's surface, and many of these later were found to have germinated, becoming known as moon trees. The crew also launched a small satellite to study the area in the vicinity of the moon. The concept of the space shuttle actually was formed in the 1950s, but design and construction of this very practical spacecraft was not begun until the 70s, and the first test flights began in 1981. With over 2.5 million parts, it's considered mankind's most complex machinery. It's had an enormously successful career as a spacecraft launched by rocket for orbital space missions. successfully launching satellites and space probes, carrying equipment and gathering research. The shuttle's special feature is that it is largely reusable, landing like a conventional aeroplane on a long runway. Of course, it's also had its tragedies: the loss of Challenger, which exploded just after launch, and Columbia, which disintegrated on re-entry. Both disasters were largely avoidable. The shuttle is scheduled for retirement in 2011, after almost 30 years in service. Forerunner of the space station, Skylab was a dedicated scientific and research space lab. Designed to be manned for lengthy periods, extensive crew training and testing was carried out to ascertain humans' ability to cope in the confined spaces, and great emphasis was placed on creating a habitable environment. The idea of an orbiting laboratory was first conceived in the 1950s and finally came to fruition in 1973, when an unmanned Skylab was launched.
This year has been a big year for Skylab. All of the hardware for the program is coming into focus. Our qualification programs are underway. The major elements of the Skylab system are in the final positions of manufacturing and checkout. Now, one of the more important things to me about Skylab is it gives us an opportunity to learn more about man's capability to work and live in space.
The much-anticipated launch took place on May 14th, but did not go to plan. The meteoroid shield, which doubled as shade for the workshop, was ripped off by atmospheric drag a little over a minute after takeoff. This also disturbed sections of the solar array, and the planned launch of the first crew had to be delayed until repairs were made, including a new insulation cloth to prevent overheating. Skylab's 3 crews stayed a total of 171 days, completing almost 300 scientific, technical, and medical experiments, as well as Earth and solar observations. Skylab paved the way for future stations like the International Space Station, due for completion in 2011.
I'm not a military analyst or anything like that. I can't say. I mean, war to end wars, no matter what today, there's maybe 20 or 30 conflicts, armed conflicts going on in the world, so it didn't do anything like that. It stopped Hitler and Nazi Germany. The tyranny of that was killed.
The Battle of Normandy in 1944, codenamed Operation Overlord, was the invasion of Nazi-occupied Western Europe by the Western Allies. It remains one of the best-known battles of World War II, and in common parlance, the expression D-Day is now invariably understood to refer to the starting date of this battle, June 6, 1944. The operation began with overnight paratrooper landings and a massive early morning amphibious assault. The fighting continued for 2.5 months before the German forces in Normandy retreated. The attack had been long in coming. From the moment when the British had been forced to withdraw from France in 1940 in the face of an overwhelming German onslaught, planners had plotted a return to the continent. Only in that way would the Allies be able to confront the enemy's power on the ground, liberate northwestern Europe, and put an end to the Nazi regime. Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, called the operation a crusade in which we will accept nothing less than full victory. The D-Day cost was high. By nightfall, more than 9,000 Allied soldiers were dead or wounded, but more than 100,000 had made it ashore and began the march across Europe to defeat Hitler. is one of the most beautiful regions of France, steeped in history from the nights of William the Conqueror to the brave soldiers who stormed the beaches one June morning. The visitor to Normandy today will find many reminders of D-Day. Most noticeable are the beaches, which are still referred to on maps and signposts by their invasion code names. At significant points there are relics, plaques, memorials or small museums. Nobody in the area is likely to forget Operation Overlord for a long time, and every year hundreds of commemorations take place.
A landing was made this morning on the coast of France by troops of the Allied Expeditionary Force. This landing is but the opening phase of the campaign in Western Europe. Great battles lie ahead. I call upon all who love freedom to stand with us now. Keep your faith staunch. Our arms are resolute. Together we shall achieve victory.
The invasion of France on June 6, 1944 was a triumph of intelligence, coordination, secrecy and planning. Ultimately successful in large due to the preparedness and bravery of the troops.
They had been trained to concert pitch and they were superb shape physically, all of them. But they were all eager for D-Day, for the starting line. They were on the starting line.
Military troops were put through their paces with rigorous invasion rehearsals and forced training sessions.
There was a Royal Ulster Rifles sergeant there, and he'd come out of Dunkirk, and he really put us through our paces. Forced marches and God knows what, 10 miles across tank training grounds and all that sort of thing. And he told us that we were going to fight the best fighting machine in the world, and if we weren't up to it, we would go under.
Amongst the troops, excitement and anticipation built in the days, weeks and months of drills and training.
Not so much frightened, I think, as excited, wondering what was going to happen and what lay ahead of us. It was something new, although we'd practiced for many, many months, battle drill and so forth. It was still high-pitched excitement, really.
It was excitement, but there was a lot of boredom. We didn't know, we knew what we'd got to do, but we didn't know when. And that was the thing, that was the most boring part, I found.
Precision trained and ready to go, the troops knew what they had to do. They knew they were to embark upon a great crusade. They knew the eyes of the world would be watching. They knew liberty was at stake for the oppressed people of Europe and the free world. Never in military history has any campaign been so long in the planning. So long anticipated and so long discussed as the Second Front. The hard part for these brave soldiers, sailors and airmen came in the waiting and not knowing when the call to action would come. In the spring of 1944, General Eisenhower had to make one of the most important decisions of World War II. Hundreds of thousands of Allied servicemen awaited his orders to begin Operation Overlord, the invasion of Europe. Eisenhower had already delayed Overlord for a month and postponed other military operations to allow the Allies enough time to build and gather together the landing craft they needed. He now set a date, June 5th, 1944. Late on the evening of June 2nd, 1944, Eisenhower, his top generals, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill met to review the weather forecast. The news was not good. D-Day, June 5th, promised cloudy skies, rain and heavy seas. Eisenhower decided to wait another day to see whether the forecast might improve. Less than 24 hours before the scheduled invasion, the forecast indicated that the rain would stop and there would be breaks in the clouds by mid-afternoon on June 5th. Eisenhower decided to change the date for D-Day to June 6th. The Allies used many different tactics in order to fool the Germans to ensure that the invasion had every chance of success. A series of elaborate deceptions were developed, all in the words of Winston Churchill, designed to provide a bodyguard of lies. Vendetta and Ferdinand were false invasions in the Western Mediterranean, and Ironside was an invasion of France from the Bay of Biscay. Zeppelin was an equally false invasion of the Balkans, and was so successful that historians continued to debate Churchill's desire to invade the Balkans rather than France. The fifth deception, Fortitude, had two parts. Fortitude North was the invasion of Norway, and Fortitude South was the invasion of France at the Pas de Calais. While each deception operation had a degree of success, Fortitude South was the key deception of when and where the D-Day invasion would actually occur. It made sense for a variety of reasons. The distance from Dover to the Pas de Calais was the shortest across the notoriously difficult English Channel. It was the shortest route to the heart of Germany, which resulted in quick turnaround time for ships and air cover. There were three large harbours in the area: Dunkirk, Calais and Boulogne. The beaches and terrain around the Pas de Calais were ideal for supporting such an invasion. Also, Fortitude South had the advantage of being the plan Adolf Hitler wanted to believe would occur. Indeed, Hitler had planned to use the same route in the opposite direction for Operation Sea Lion, the aborted German plan to invade Great Britain. The complexity of the deceit and trickery aided and abetted the most organised and successful campaign in World War II history. On the night before the amphibious landings, 23,000 US and British paratroopers landed in France behind the German defensive lines by parachute and glider. Under overall command of General Eisenhower and on the ground of British General Bernard Montgomery, Allied troops landed on 5 beaches, codenamed Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword and Utah. The invasion force of more than 155,000 troops included 50,000 vehicles, nearly 7,000 naval craft, and more than 11,500 aircraft supported the invasion. The Germans, under the command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had deployed 5 infantry divisions, 1 airborne division and 1 tank division along the Normandy coast and held the advantage in battle positioning. The Allies had an overwhelming advantage in naval and air power. On D-Day alone, the Allies flew 14,000 sorties. The German Air Force managed only 500. The success of the amphibious landings depended on the establishment of a secure lodgement from which to expand the beachhead to allow the build-up of a well-supplied force capable of breaking out.
The sea was black with ships. As we moved into the open sea, you could hardly call it open, because from one end of the, it seemed to be one end of the channel to the other, were these ships of all descriptions. We thought we could not lose the war, that this is just, there's never been an armada like this. I'd never imagined anything so tremendous.
An important part was the isolation of the invasion routes and beaches from any intervention by the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine. The responsibility for this was assigned to the Royal Navy's Home Fleet. There were two principal perceived German naval threats. The first was surface attack by German capital ships from anchorages in Scandinavia and the Baltic Sea. This did not materialise. The second perceived major threat was that of U-boats transferred from the Atlantic. Air surveillance from 3 escort carriers and RAF Coastal Command maintained a cordon well west of Land's End. Few U-boats were spotted. Most of the escort groups were moved nearer to the landings. Further efforts were made to seal the western approaches against German naval forces from Brittany and the Bay of Biscay. Minefields, naval and air patrols, radar and effective bombing raids on enemy ports closed the Straits of Dover.
When we were about 100 yards out, he said, right, we're going in now, and full speed ahead, hit the beach.
Planners chose the Normandy beaches because they lay within range of air cover and were less heavily defended than the obvious objective of the Pas-de-Calais. Men were sent in by parachute and by glider, and on this side of the channel, through binoculars and gun sights, German soldiers could see coming their way the greatest armada anyone had ever seen. In the lead were hundreds of landing craft, carrying brave and frightened men. Only the ones who made that crossing can know what it was like. They tell of the pitching deck, the whistles of shells from the battleships behind them, the white jets of water from enemy fire around them, and then the sound of bullets hitting the steel ramp that was about to fall. One GI later said, "As our boat touched sand and the ramp went down, I became a visitor to hell." Hitler's Atlantic Wall was composed of mines and tank obstacles, trenches and jutting cliffs, gun emplacements and pillboxes, barbed wire, machine gun nests, and artillery trained accurately on the beach. 6 divisions were to land on the first day, 3 US, 2 British and 1 Canadian. 2 more British and 1 US division were to follow up after the assault division had cleared the way through the beach defences. On Sword Beach, the regular British infantry came ashore with light casualties. The Canadian forces that landed on Juno Beach faced heavy batteries of machine gun nests, pillboxes, other concrete fortifications, and a seawall twice the height of the one at Omaha Beach. Juno was the second most heavily defended beach on D-Day, next to Omaha. At Gold, the casualties were also quite heavy, because the Germans had strongly fortified a village on the beach.
The 716th Division, the German division, right. they weren't the best of troops. They were the sort of, what's they cannon fodder.
Casualties on Utah Beach, the westernmost landing zone, were the lightest of any beach, with 197 out of the roughly 23,000 troops that landed. At Omaha Beach, now known as Bloody Omaha, the Americans faced the veteran German 352nd Infantry Division, one of the best trained on the beaches. 2,200 casualties resulted. Despite heavy losses, by end of day June 6th, Allied troops had gained a foothold at Omaha. The landing craft Vehicle Personnel, LCVP or Higgins boat, played an important role in the Normandy invasion. This was the landing craft used to land troops directly into the sandy teeth of the most heavily fortified German sector, Omaha Beach. Designer Andrew Higgins, a fire-tempered Irishman from Louisiana, was positive once the war broke out that there would be a need among the US Navy for thousands of small boats, and was also sure that steel would be in short supply. In a common moment of eccentricity, Higgins bought the entire 1939 crop of mahogany from the Philippines. Higgins struggled for years to convince the Navy of the need for small wooden boats. Finally, he signed the contract to develop his LCVP. President Eisenhower, in a 1964 interview, stated, "Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us." If Higgins had not designed and built those LCVPs, we never could have landed over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different. On D-Day itself, the Allies landed 11 divisions on the French coast, but failed in reaching their planned objective of linking the beachheads or driving inland to a distance of 9 miles. At the end of the afternoon, the beach was under control, but frequently German snipers opened fire on the landing troops or on the casualties awaiting their evacuation towards England. Within 5 days, on June the 11th, Allied troops overcame German resistance to unite the invasion beaches into one large beachhead. On July 25th, Allied troops broke out of the Normandy beachhead near the town of Saint-Lô and began to pour into northern France.
We were shelled and mortared and don't do whatever, but I was surprised how far we actually got in. There was a lot of fighting that went on, but I was still surprised how far we got. I didn't think we would get off the beaches.
By mid-August, Allied troops had encircled and destroyed much of the German army in Normandy in the Falaise pocket.
Ich bin im Februar 40 Soldat geworden, war also bis dahin ja, ein Vierteljahre Soldat. Das Thema Gefangenschaft hat es nie gegeben, weder im Rekrutenunterricht noch sonst irgendwo. Nie wurde von Gefangenschaft gesprochen. Das gab es für einen deutschen Soldaten nicht. Und in meiner Russlandzeit, glaube ich, hätte ich mich wahrscheinlich nicht ergeben.
Spearheaded by General George Patton's Third Army, the Allies then raced across France. On August the 25th, Free French forces liberated Paris. On September 16, US troops reached the border of Germany. It had been a grim fight. 6 weeks of battle had left the Germans disheartened and susceptible to any further blow the Allies might deliver. The days had been filled with mud, heartache and pain for the Allies as well. From the very beginning, little had seemed to go right. As a result, the effort had only a marginal effect on the developing battle. Over the days that followed, rather than withdrawing beyond the Seine, as Allied planners had expected, the Germans had hung on tenaciously, taking brutal losses, but inflicting them upon the Allies as well. Meanwhile, Montgomery's careful plan for the attack had begun to unravel on D-Day itself. His forces failed to take Caen, the key to further operations in the open country to the south. Attacking time and again as the campaign developed, they had nonetheless held the cream of the German force in place. As for the Americans, a landing on Omaha Beach had been a near disaster, averted only by the courage of unsung sailors and soldiers. When air attacks and naval gunfire had failed to silence German guns, and the momentum of the assault had begun to lag, those heroes had pushed their frail landing craft to shore, despite the traps and obstacles blocking their way. Rallying to the directions of their commanders, they had then climbed the bluffs overlooking the beach and advanced inland, often at the cost of their own lives.
The intensity was the other thing, the noise and the firing and the organization. I mean, they say D-Day was 4 years in planning, 2 years in organizing, 1 day in execution, and that was it. It was all happening on that day, it seemed.
Even so, enough went well for the campaign to succeed. Roosevelt, Marshall, Eisenhower, Churchill and Montgomery were master communicators who bonded an unwieldy coalition into an extraordinary fighting machine. In the end, it was the heroism of infantrymen who rose day and night to the challenge, despite almost overwhelming fear and fatigue, that afforded the critical margin for success.
When we were young, there was a lot left to the imagination. Today they've got television.
Yes,
they've seen the Gulf War, they've seen the Falklands, and they find it very difficult to relate what they've seen on television to the reality that we experience.
The loss of France would deprive Germany not only of a major source of raw resources and labour, but also of seaports that had long sheltered its U-boats, and of radar sites that had afforded early warning of Allied bomber attacks. More important, it would provide the Allies with the secure base they needed to launch their final offensive against the German heartland.
It would have been the end for all of us, of life as we knew it. It was really a tremendous crusade, and it came off.
The brutal reign of one of the 20th century's most notorious and bloodiest dictators, Idi Amin, began on January 25, 1971, when he seized control of Uganda in a military coup. And so began an 8-year reign of terror, torture, and the murder of up to 300,000 people. The military coup was executed with planned precision, while Prime Minister Milton Obote was absent in Singapore. Amin's troops sealed off Entebbe International Airport, a main artery into Uganda, and took the capital, Kampala. After hearing Radio Uganda broadcast that Obote's government was riddled with corruption, Ugandans cheered and celebrated in the streets as they welcomed the coming of a new regime.
I have therefore decided that all forms of political activities such as public discussions, meetings and rallies will not at the moment be permitted. They are therefore suspended with immediate effect.
Amin assured the people he was a soldier, not a politician, and that the military government would act as a caretaker regime until elections were announced. As part of his hold, Amin expelled 80,000 Asians from the country and confiscated their assets, insisting they leave Uganda by flying East African Airways. They were given 90 days to leave the country based on his belief they were hoarding wealth and goods, thus disadvantaging Africans and sabotaging the Ugandan economy.
I am very tough, yes, and I will never give up. If I wanted to do something, I will never change my mind.
The ethnic cleansing of Uganda by Amin extended into his purging the country of Obote supporters, mainly those from the Akolai and Lengo ethnic groups. First soldiers were massacred and then civilians began to disappear in this climate of violence.
How many people have been killed under this regime? The number runs into thousands. Hundreds of thousands. Hundreds of thousands. Hundreds of thousands.
While Amin was initially welcomed by the Ugandan people and the international community, this soon soured as terror and fear swept the country.
I feel extremely distressed because what is happening in Uganda is a human tragedy of great magnitude. Amin is not a joke. Amin is a killer. He's a murderer. He was not like that before the coup. But having obtained power, absolute power, he has become a great murderer, and I think the world should not treat him as a joke. He's a serious phenomenon.
In the late 1800s, Uganda became a British protectorate, turning it into a constitutional monarchy controlled mainly by Protestant chiefs. The 35th king of Kabaka of then Uganda was King Mutusa, also known as King Freddy. He earned the respect of his people by protesting the British government's plan to unite Uganda, Kenya and Tanganyika as British East Africa, fearing Africans would come under the control of Kenya's white settlers. King Mutesa was exiled and after 2 years allowed to return as a constitutional monarch. Uganda celebrated as Britain granted it independence in October 1962, yet there was little indication the country was headed for disaster. Uganda began its newfound political system as a model of stability and potential progress. The first post-independence election saw Milton Obote installed as Prime Minister, and King Freddie Kabaka Edward Matusa II becoming the country's first president, largely a ceremonial role that replaced the Governor-General. Under this new constitution, one Milton Obote helped draft, Uganda maintained its Commonwealth membership and the country was set to enjoy a time of considerable autonomy. As Prime Minister Obote was sworn in by then Governor-General Sir William Cootes, the Ugandan people looked forward to a new future with its own people at the helm. Sadly, Uganda's decline began with this first head of state. As Uganda's people saw this newfound independence as heralding a fresh start, Prime Minister Obote's popularity was short-lived and started to fade as he bolstered the power of the army and formed an alliance with his appointed army chief, Idi Amin. Slowly, a new form of government was beginning to unfold. The country's leadership took a different turn when, in 1966, Obote designated himself president for life, disbanded tribal monarchies, and introduced a socialist style of government. This sparked outrage among the people, and it ended the rule of King Freddie, who represented the largest Ugandan tribe, the Baganda. Obote suspended the constitution and moved towards a one-party centralised state, where he assumed all government powers and abolished traditional kingdoms, including that of his former ally, King Freddie. The king was forced into exile to the UK, a situation the powerful Ugandan people could not forgive. Obote's new regime quickly evolved into one that was dictatorial and barbaric as his secret police general service unit methodically terrorised, harassed and tortured. Political opponents were jailed for life without trial. Indian traders were persecuted, leading to massive food shortages, and corruption was rife. In January 1971, Obote flew to Singapore, leaving Idi Amin free to strike. In his early military life, Idi Amin had risen to the highest rank possible for a black African in the British Army. He then fostered a close and loyal relationship with Obote after he became Prime Minister in 1962 and was promoted by Obote to Captain, then Army Commander. Their alliance deepened in the mid-1960s when they were implicated in a deal to smuggle ivory and gold into Uganda from the Congo. When Parliament demanded an investigation, Obote imposed the new constitution. It was Amin who led an attack on the King's Palace, which forced him into exile in the UK. As Army Commander, Amin recruited members from his own tribe and other ethnic groups that bordered Sudan and steadily increased his own power base. Eventually, a rift developed between Amin and Obote, which was worsened by Amin's military recruitment mission and an assassination attempt on Obote's life in 1969. Obote took control of the armed forces and demoted Amin from his newly appointed post as Commander of the Armed Forces to Commander of the Army. Relations soured further when Amin learned of Obote's plan to arrest and imprison him for misappropriating army funds. Time ran out for Obote. As he flew to Singapore, Amin seized power in a military coup that heralded yet another violent chapter in Uganda's history. Seizing his opportunity with the military precision of a despot, Idi Amin rallied his troops and blocked off the Entebbe International Airport, the main artery into Uganda, and took Kampala. He had soldiers surround Obote's home and blocked major roads. Amin's overthrow was further supported by a Radio Uganda broadcast that accused Obote's government of corruption and preferential treatment of his own tribal people in the Lango region. The coup was cemented when Idi Amin announced he was a soldier, not a politician, and that the military government would remain as a caretaker until new elections were held. In his new role, he promised to release all political prisoners. Yet the Ugandan people were unaware these promised changes were a smokescreen for the man soon to be known as the Butcher of Uganda. Outside Kampala, at the ancient tomb of previous Baganda kings, the Baganda tribe joyfully greeted the demise of Obote with dancing, singing and drumming. The euphoria of change continued as, true to his word, Idi Amin released political prisoners held by the Obote regime into the arms of waiting families and friends.
The Tanzanian troops are preparing with the modern Chinese arms requested by Dr. Apollo Milton Obote to come and attack Uganda. I have therefore decided that all forms of political activities such as public discussions, meetings and rallies will not at the moment be permitted. They are therefore suspended with immediate effect.
On February 2, 1971, as troops fired a salute to their new leader, Idi Amin inspected the Guard of Honour and took his oath as the new leader.
I will well and truly exercise the functions of the head of government of the Republic of Uganda, so help me God.
By late 1972, Idi Amin's autocratic leadership was already cemented when he decreed Uganda's 80,000 Asians, mostly Gujaratis of Indian origin, were to leave Uganda. He gave them 90 days to leave their country.
The responsibility of Asians in Uganda, it is the responsibility of Great Britain.
As reports of the expulsion ricocheted worldwide, Idi Amin claimed the Indians were sabotaging the Ugandan economy by hoarding wealth and goods and disadvantaging indigenous Africans. Leaving all they owned in the hands of Amin's government, thousands of now destitute Indian people sought refuge in other countries as they left their homeland for the last time by aeroplane or train.
My action, if you are actually to see and check it carefully, you will find this is not against Britain at all. It is only transferring the economy to the hands of Ugandans. Everybody in Uganda, members of the armed forces, police, and the public, they are responsible for my security. And immediately they hear anybody making subversive activities or try to plan anything against me, they report that person straight to the police.
It's a nightmare for Ugandans. It's a nightmare for friends of Uganda. I mean, it's not a joke, and Uganda is not a joke. The situation is bad. It's bad for everybody, who is interested in human rights.
While Amin grasped the mantle of presidential pomp and ceremony and emblazoned himself with many self-appointed military medals, his rule quickly escalated into a fearsome, violent and murderous regime. His reign as the Butcher of Uganda was well underway, as he systematically set out purging the army of Obote supporters, mainly those from the Akolai and Lengo ethnic groups. His brutal and cold-blooded killings continued throughout his time as president, to include members of other ethnic groups, religious leaders, journalists, senior bureaucrats, judges, and countless others killed for criminal motives or at Amin's own behest.
The people know very well that what I did to them, they did not expect if it is Uganda will be like today, and therefore I am one of their heroes.
Ironically, while people were pursued and murdered throughout the country at his order, Idi Amin was a dutiful mourner with other dignitaries at state funerals. Church leaders who were openly critical of his regime were removed, and the world became angered when Anglican Archbishop Jane Luam and 2 cabinet ministers were murdered in February 1977.
The number runs into thousands, hundreds of thousands.
Hundreds of thousands.
Hundreds of thousands. Now, publicity really is about important people, persons who have been ministers, ambassadors, senior army officers, managers of parastatal organizations, university lecturers and professors and people like that. But there are hundreds and hundreds of peasants and workers who have also died.
Uganda's international relations collapsed as the world watched in horror when Idi Amin allowed an Air France airliner that had been hijacked by pro-Palestinians land at Entebbe airport. More than 100 non-Jewish hostages were released, while 83 Jews and Israeli citizens, plus 20 who would not abandon them, remained hostage. Ugandan soldiers and the hijackers were taken by surprise as 3 Hercules transport planes landed from Israel. In the short, fierce battle, 3 hostages were killed, as well as all 7 hijackers, 20 Ugandan soldiers and 1 Israeli soldier. A 4th hostage, 75-year-old Dora Block, who was injured and taken to Kampala Hospital, was later murdered in reprisal.
That raid has put Israeli in a very bad position for future hijacking, because the future hijacking, any country, not even Uganda, but any country will be very, very careful and will not give time for the Israeli to rescue their hijackers or any country.
In 1978, an invasion by Tanzanian troops and Ugandan exiles brought unrest in the border area. Former Ugandan leader Milton Obote drew on his unrest and urged Ugandans to rebel against President Idi Amin.
I call for a Uganda-wide rebellion. Amin has turned the gun both out of the sweat and toil of the people of Uganda against those same people. He has turned the Pearl of Africa into a human slaughterhouse. I call upon Ugandans in the Uganda Army and Air Force to rise up to their national duty by combining their efforts with those of the masses to overthrow fascist and dictator Amin.
Amin's demise was well underway as Tanzanian troops met little resistance and swept towards the capital, Kampala. While the troops took the Owen Falls Bridge near the strategic industrial town of Jinja, it is said Amin's forces left behind a trail of atrocities, with 60 civilians said to have been hurled to their deaths from the Owen Falls Dam. Backed by several groups of Ugandan exiles, the Ugandan National Liberation Army, the Tanzanian People's Defence Force, waged its war of liberation against Amin's troops in a determined attempt to end his reign of terror. The battles were intense and resulted in the steady retreat of Amin's troops, despite his military assistance from Libya's Gaddafi. Tanzanian and UNLA troops advanced towards Kampala, first taking the Entebbe airport and then Kampala itself, meeting little resistance. The butcher of Uganda was finally facing the end. As Kampala fell to the invading troops on April 11, 1979, a gruesome chapter in Uganda's history ended when Idi Amin was forced into exile and fled by helicopter to Libya. The Ugandan people celebrated as one of the world's most brutal and murderous regimes collapsed, leaving in its wake the senseless death of hundreds of thousands of innocent people, many who were tortured and maimed. The mood was euphoric as the Ugandan people celebrated Idi Amin's demise and the promise of a new beginning. With the overthrow of Idi Amin complete, Milton Obote returned from exile in Tanzania and on December 15, 1980, seized power as President of Uganda, 9 years after being overthrown by Amin.
I, Apollo Milton Obote, do solemnly swear that I will well and truly exercise the functions of the high office of President of the Republic of Uganda.
The swearing-in of Obote as president marked a new beginning for a country torn apart by Idi Amin's dictatorship. And while the country was jubilant that Amin was gone, Obote's reign was soon evolved into one marred by dissatisfaction. Having been granted sanctuary in Saudi Arabia, Idi Amin died on August 16, 2003, having never returned to Uganda.
Total, who knows how many people he's responsible for killing. The legacy of that in Uganda has been a long and terrifyingly sad one, because often they were the brightest people, young men, often university educated, who he took out.
Idi Amin maintained that Uganda had needed him, and he never expressed remorse for the nature of his regime.
Many of my friends and colleagues actually suffered at his hands, and a number died. I mean, there was a dreadful, dreadful history, and the whole infrastructure of the country was wrecked.
One hopes and prays that they will finally get leaders around the whole continent who will never again be able to do what Idi Amin did for so long and get away with it. He never paid a price. He never faced justice.
On the morning of March 16, 1978, wild weather raged in the ocean off the coast of France. Howling winds and huge waves lashed at a VLCC, a very large crude carrier, otherwise known as the Amoco Cadiz. This was a massive oil supertanker designed to withstand heavy sea crossings, although this was a storm worse than most of the experienced crew had ever known. The elements did indeed prove too much, and the supertanker became grounded and began losing oil. For as long as ships have been carrying oil, they'd been spilling it, but the Amoco Cadiz was to be the worst oil spill at sea of its time. Continuing high winds spread the oil slick over a large area, washing up onto pristine beaches in France's second most important fishing area and tourist region. It was a national disaster for France, as the military and volunteers rushed to try and contain the spill and mop up the damage. The environmental consequences were enormous and long-lasting. Coastal lands were severely affected, and massive numbers of seabirds died, their feathers clogged with the gluggy oil. Even after careful cleaning by volunteers, most still died, having already ingested oil as they tried to clean themselves and causing major organs to fail. Many lessons were learned from the Amoco Cadiz, but unfortunately not how to prevent it happening again. Weeks after the spill began, the tanker was still leaking oil into the ocean. The French Navy finally sank the Amoco Cadiz using depth charges. Today, it's a popular dive wreck and a haven for fish species. We all rely on oil. It's so much part of our everyday life. Worldwide in 2009, we used an average 85 million barrels. That's just under 10 billion litres of oil per day. Of course, it's fundamental to much of our transport, but also is a base component in many consumer products like plastics, pharmaceuticals, paints, and synthetic fibres. Vast undersea oil reserves are increasingly tapped to meet this demand. Wells, sometimes kilometers away, feed oil up to the production platform for processing, where the oil is separated off from associated water and gas and pumped to the tanker. Supertankers are frequently used in the oil industry. Able to transport large quantities over long distances, as well as for bulk storage. The VLCC Amoco Cadiz was fairly typical, over 300 meters long and with a carrying capacity of over 230,000 tons. These ships are so vast, crew members use bicycles to move around. They're also an extremely cost-efficient means of transporting oil, representing just 2 cents a gallon at the bowser. In February 1978, the Amoco Cadiz, laden with crude oil from Iran and Saudi Arabia, set off for Rotterdam around the Cape of Good Hope. On the morning of March 16th, as the tanker neared Western Europe, it headed into a storm of intense ferocity. A heavy wave hit its rudder, crippling the ship's steering completely. The captain alerted nearby ships of its status, and after establishing the steering was beyond repair, called for a tugboat an hour later. The Pacific, a salvage tug from West Germany, arrived soon after, and the crew made several failed attempts to fix a tow line and move the ship, working into the night. The sheer mass of the tanker was too great, and it continued drifting towards the coast, eventually running aground. A section of its hull was ripped open, and it began leaking oil, although the massive onboard containers of oil still remained intact. While the tug's crew members tried to move the tanker, Both captains were sidelined by lengthy negotiations with Amoco, the ship's owner in Chicago, over the salvage terms. Amoco had originally wanted it towed, not salvaged, as the rights represented millions of dollars, and it was several hours before Amoco finally agreed. Whether this affected the outcome is unknown, as the crew went ahead anyway, but it cannot have helped. It's also believed that had the tanker's captain called for a tug earlier, a larger one would have been available, although the same salvage issues presumably would have arisen. During the night, the French Navy airlifted the crew to safety, and at 10 the next morning, the ship broke in two. The Amoco Cadiz was carrying crude oil, 1.6 million barrels of it, and now this vast quantity began spilling out into the ocean, spreading rapidly in the churning water. For 2 weeks, the tanker continuously spilled oil into the ocean, adding steadily to the already huge slick. Although the tanker continued to break apart, it remained defiantly afloat until the French Navy used depth charges and finally got the vessel to sink. When the tanker first began spilling oil, the hope was to pump out what was remaining on board, but the weather was far too rough. An oil slick several kilometers long spread quickly on the currents, washing onto shore. The heavy seas whipped the oil and water together like chocolate cake mix, a thick sludge oozing onto the land, coating the rocks, sand and pink granite of the beaches with a filthy dark scum. On several beaches, the oil permeated down to a depth of ½ meter and combined with the sand to form an asphalt crust that persisted for years. By a month, 76 different Breton beaches and 320 kilometers of coastland were oiled, and once pretty rock pools were oil pools. The rapid spread of the oil posed serious threats, and French authorities constantly monitored the weather in an attempt to forecast its likely coverage. This was a concern not just for France, as the oil spread across the English Channel, reaching the Channel Islands by the end of April, with the island of Guernsey just 100 kilometers from the English coast.
How big a part do you think the weather will play in the position of the slick and the chance of it hitting the English coast?
Well, the condition of the sea and the prevailing winds are very important in this. There, as we learned from the Ekofisk situation, there can be a natural dispersal of the oil. Of course, we're hoping that that will be the case. We're hoping that the spraying will also contribute to the dispersal of the oil. But we will have to wait and see. All we can do is to mobilize to the full the resources that we've got available and do our best to protect the Channel Islands and our own coastline.
From the very outset, the weather was the worst it could be. The whole sorry episode began with wild conditions, and these continued to hamper any attempts to minimize the disaster. Tugs couldn't get near the ship to try and clean up the spill at its source, but worse, the heavy winds quickly whipped up the oil. At sea, endeavors were ineffective, and efforts at mitigating the damage soon focused on the shoreline. A common practice in containing oil spills is the use of booms. Partially submerged, these act as barriers, trapping the oil on top of the water. This contained oil can then be skimmed or pumped into a storage tank. The first booms used for oil spills were made from telephone poles. In later years, these were replaced by lightweight foam booms, as well as inflatable versions. In Brittany, these worked well in the few areas that were sheltered and consequently where waters were calm. But the continuing rough seas meant that much of the oil escaped over the booms and made its way to shore. With the wild weather, the tugs sat idle. the sea defense all but lost while the land campaign began. 1/4 of the Breton coast was affected, and the cleanup process lasted more than 6 months, involving heavy machinery brought in from all over France, thousands of members of the army, and a large contingent of volunteers. At this point, a little over 1/3 of the oil had spilled from the Amoco Cadiz, with more than 1 million barrels yet to steadily leak into the ocean. On shore, the military attempted to pump oil off into tankers, but much of it had already penetrated down through layers of sand, which had to be painstakingly shoveled off. For workers, it must have felt like a losing battle, as the use of detergents to break down the oil was now known to be more dangerous than the oil itself. This was out. Dispersants, which still remain contentious today, were used, but with little effect. A substantial amount of the oil and water mixture was pumped out for treatment, but the quantity of oil extracted was less than 10% of what entered the ocean. Because the storm weather had dumped large amounts of seaweed and other debris, the hoses were frequently blocked, and workers had to resort to using buckets, a slow and laborious process. The violent churning of the stormy seas had the effect of creating an emulsion of water trapped within the oil. This whipped mixture was 5 times larger than the oil on its own, and constituted what is appropriately called chocolate mousse. This mousse drifted on the ocean, spreading for miles, and infiltrated around the rocks and granite into the pools and onto the shores. The oil had a devastating effect on marine life, and around 37,000 birds are believed to have died. The oil penetrated their plumage, affecting their buoyancy and their insulation. Unable to fly, swim, or eat, they had little hope of survival. Further, in trying to clean themselves, the birds ingested the oil, which played havoc on their kidneys, livers, and stomachs. Even after cleaning, less than 1% of birds usually survive such trauma. The entire food chain was affected, from underwater plant life and algae through to seals, which died of hypothermia due to oil-coated fur. Millions of sea creatures died: oysters, periwinkles, sea urchins, and others. Brittany, a major source of France's oysters, lost most of its oyster beds. 9,000 tons of oysters were poisoned or had to be destroyed as a safety precaution in the aftermath of the spill. This part of France is one of the most important marine areas, accounting for about 15% of the country's oyster production. It's also a major source of shellfish, including lobsters, which were badly oiled. Several large lobster holding tanks operated in the area and struggled to maintain supplies. In this region, so reliant on its tourism and seafood, the result was catastrophic. A little after 8 one night in February 1996, the oil tanker Sea Empress struck mid-channel rocks as it entered the Milford Haven waterway in Wales. In one of Europe's most significant wildlife and marine conservation areas, oil began pouring out of the ship's punctured hull. The equivalent of more than 500,000 barrels of oil entered the sea, sparking a full-scale emergency alert. The oil initially drifted towards 2 important island nature reserves, but a change of wind turned it towards the popular tourist beaches, coating 200 kilometers of pristine coastline in crude oil. For all concerned, the immediate worry was the impact on the delicate ecosystem of this important area.
Much of the oil that has escaped so far has now come ashore, and we have picked up, I think it's about 100 oiled birds. If we have bad weather this evening and more oil does get out into the open sea, then it may well be an environmental disaster.
The RSPB set up a bird hospital where the oiled birds were cleaned with detergent and charcoal was pushed down their gullets to absorb the oil. The result could have been much worse. Millions of migratory seabirds were due to arrive at their breeding grounds in a few weeks' time, and the losses would have been colossal. The at-sea containment, dispersal and cleanup process was completed within 6 weeks. Aircraft were brought in to spray chemicals which dispersed about a quarter of the oil, so that the natural process of bacterial breakdown could occur. At the site of the leak, high winds made it difficult for workers trying to siphon off the oil, and only about 2% could be recovered. These winds did assist, however, by blowing most of the oil away from the coast and out to sea, dispersing a great deal more. With this effort, only about 7% of the spill reached the shore. While the onshore cleanup would ultimately last 5 years, much was completed within a few weeks, rendering the beaches superficially clean in time for the tourist season. Fishing was banned for several months, but the local industry was compensated. 3 years after the spill, small amounts of oil could still be found under the sand in sheltered areas and in some of the rock pools, but overall, the area made a surprisingly good recovery. The MV Brouwer was carrying a large amount of Norwegian crude, a lighter and more easily biodegradable oil. Caught in a hurricane, the tanker lost power and ran aground off Shetland, Scotland. The extreme winds dispersed most of the oil, and less than 1% reached shore. The huge wind, however, also caused problems, picking up oil and spraying it over a large inland area, contaminating freshwater lakes and destroying fields. Bird and marine losses were high, and salmon farms showed oil concentrations up to 20,000 times normal levels. The area's fishing was suspended, with some bans in place for more than 7 years.
Evidently, we get some oil, and we're going to be here for a while.
When the Exxon Valdez ran aground in Alaska's Prince William Sound in 1989, it created an ecological disaster, smearing 1,300 miles of Alaskan coastline and covering 11,000 square miles of ocean. It killed 250,000 birds, 3,000 otters, and numerous bald eagles, seals, and orca whales. Billions of salmon and herring eggs were destroyed, causing the herring industry to collapse with massive ongoing hardship. 32,000 affected people launched a class action against ExxonMobil, whose tanker captain was allegedly drunk. The company appealed the $5 billion for punitive damages, about 6 weeks' profits, whittling it down to just over $500 million, an average payment of $16,000. On April 20th, 2010, BP's Deepwater Horizon rig in the Gulf of Mexico exploded and collapsed, causing a massive leak. A BP internal document quoted a worst-case scenario of 100,000 barrels spilling daily, plus quantities of natural gas. This would eclipse previous offshore spills, an environmental disaster compounded by the use of highly toxic chemical dispersants. Experts state the total spill could completely wipe out marine life in a very large area and alter the chemistry of the waters, with results lasting for decades. With accusations that BP ignored prior warnings and criticisms of its response, the company faces an ongoing backlash from an angry public, particularly Americans. World demand for oil continues to climb, particularly as more nations rapidly industrialize. Agriculture and industry are big consumers, but transport remains the major factor. An estimated 500 million passenger cars are on the roads every day worldwide, a number that's climbing, with huge demand from China, the world's biggest car market. In the first half of 2010, new car sales jumped 47%, with 9 million vehicles sold. Other nations like India and Brazil have also seen dramatic sales growth. The environmental consequences of oil spills are immense, with bird deaths the most visible result. In marine areas, the entire food chain can be disrupted, from the tiniest plankton through the many stages between, to the seals, dolphins, and whales. Coral reefs are killed off, and fish and seafood species are poisoned by the oil, and in themselves become poisonous. The collapse of fisheries can have terrible human consequences, such as in Alaska after Exxon Valdez, where bankruptcies, suicides, marriage breakups, and depression were common. People often feel abandoned and angry, frustrated by the response of the big oil companies and the bureaucracy of government. They've seen their whole way of life, their future disappear, through no fault of their own. The long-term implications of oil spills are little understood, and many of the facts are often buried or manipulated. In a world driven by share markets, tainted beaches, dead wildlife, and bankrupt families are the roadkill. Long after the cleanup, when the oil company has moved on to another drill zone, the pollution continues. It seems many of us are forgetful when it's a matter of convenience. We need transport, we need energy and warmth, and the options just aren't as cheap and convenient. Oil is big business. It drives economies, it influences government decision-making, and has excellent spin. So the Amoco Cadiz, the Exxon Valdez, the other spills fade into distant memory until the next shocking footage appears on our screens. But sooner or later, the effects will be too serious to ignore. By that time, it may already be.
Union Carbide's old pesticide factory remains untouched, haunting the crowded Indian city of Bhopal, a constant reminder of the region's darkest night. The leak of a lethal cocktail of gases on the night of December 3, 1984 from the factory was the world's worst industrial disaster. Gross negligence by the Union Carbide Corporation is widely viewed as the cause of the tragedy.
There is basically an attempt to escape minimal requirements for regulation, and this can be done easily abroad where foreign governments are eager for American capital. No questions are asked. Workers are poor, are illiterate. They're job hunting. They will take any job. They don't understand the dangers.
By morning, Bhopal resembled a scene from hell, with the streets littered with human corpses. 40 tons of the gas methyl isocyanate, an incredibly volatile substance which wreaks havoc upon the human body in the tiniest proportions, had escaped and gradually engulfed the city as it was waking. People were in agony, water streaming from their eyes and noses, coughing violently as the gas attacked eye and lung tissue, as well as the central nervous system.
It's a terrible thing to have to say, but it looks as if a colossal, hideous experiment has been conducted. And I think we're going to learn an awful lot about the toxic nature of methyl isocyanate and its effects on humans from this terrible tragedy.
The fumes killed more than 3,500 people and affected 800,000 people, according to official figures, while other estimates put the number of dead at 30,000. Immediately after the disaster, Union Carbide, the company involved, began attempts to disassociate itself from legal responsibility for the gas leak. Eventually, a settlement with the Indian government was reached through mediation by the country's Supreme Court, and Union Carbide accepted moral responsibility. The company paid $470 million in compensation, a relatively small amount based on significant underestimations of the long-term health consequences of exposure and the number of people exposed. As further insult, Union Carbide discontinued operation at its Bhopal plant following the disaster, but failed to clean up the industrial site completely. The plant continued to leak several toxic chemicals and heavy metals that have found their way into local aquifers. Dangerously contaminated water has now been added to the legacy left by the company for the people of Bhopal. The activity of multinational companies is controversial worldwide, and India is no exception, with one of the largest concentrations of foreign-based companies. The top 300 multinationals are all represented in India, and many more foreign firms are in joint deals with Indian trading houses. The importance of multinationals in terms of the number of Indians they employ is far less than the overall effect on the economy. 1 million Indians work for foreign companies, a little less than 5% of the country's official labour force, but the capital they bring in makes a significant contribution to the economy. The Indian consumer can buy thousands of foreign brand name products, from chocolates to detergents, the list is endless, and foreign products are synonymous with social status. Foreign companies may earn money by exporting, but they also rely heavily on imported materials. It's India's cheap and limitless pool of labour, both unskilled and highly qualified, which attracts the multinationals. The companies argue their Western-style organisation enables them to produce goods more efficiently than their Indian counterparts. Philip Daubonnet is the Managing Director of Indian Explosives Limited, the local arm of ICI.
Well, I think the things we can bring are technology, which may be something we have developed ourselves where there is complicated know-how, or it may be in the area of efficiency. We believe we're an efficient company. For example, we and some other Indian fertilizer companies have an occupancy rate of 90%, whereas the average might well be about 70%, and that's a measure of efficiency.
Critics allege, however, that the government regulations, which limit foreign involvement both in decision-making and providing personnel, contributed to the Union Carbide tragedy at Bhopal. In the wake of the disaster, multinationals received bad press, and the people blamed the government for not controlling Union Carbide's activities.
There is one more aspect also. You see, in industry has no say with respect to the land use around it. Industry is allotted a piece of land which is given to it, but then the next door land is owned by the government or by some other individuals, and what use they are making of it. For example, if the slums come up next door to a toxic industry, I do not know how industry can stop it because they have no control over it.
India does, however, apply far stricter controls on foreign companies than most third world governments. The government wants foreign companies which can contribute to capital and expertise in new high-tech industry to help with the modernisation of India.
The government's attitude, I think, is that if a multinational has something particularly attractive to the state of India, then it will be allowed to operate. For example, if it has some particular technology, and certainly it can bring in capital, which is always a short resource, then the operation of the various laws will normally allow that company to operate and build, say, a plant to make explosives or fertilizers.
In 1969, Union Carbide Corporation, UCC, built a pesticide plant on the outskirts of Bhopal and became one of the first US companies to invest in India. The company built the plant in Bhopal because of its central location and transport infrastructure. The specific site within the city was zoned for light industrial and commercial, not for hazardous industry. The plant produced pesticides to help the country's agricultural sector increase its productivity and contribute more significantly to meeting the food needs of one of the world's most heavily populated regions. Pressure from competition in the chemical industry led to UCIL, the Indian subsidiary of UCC, to implement backward integration, the manufacture of raw materials and intermediate products. This was inherently a more sophisticated and hazardous process. This also led to a decision by UCC executives to store on site the First World War gas MIC, an incredibly volatile and deadly substance. MIC was to be used as a cost-effective intermediary to produce the pesticide carbaryl, even though other manufacturers had refused to use the substance on the grounds of safety. Alarmingly, UCC opted to ignore regulations with regard to quantities of MIC held on site and storage of the substance. Widespread crop failures and famine on the subcontinent in the 1980s led to increased indebtedness and decreased capital for farmers to buy pesticides. UC bosses decided to go on a cost-cutting spree, which involved the reckless enforced redundancy of maintenance staff, the use of cheaper, often defective materials for repair work, and the disengagement of safety systems. In 1982, a safety audit by US engineers noted the filthy condition of the plant, including corroding pipelines, faulty valves, and warned of dangerous toxic release. As the situation worsened and minor gas leaks began to occur, journalists and factory staff began warning locals of a terrible danger. Notably, Raj Keswani wrote a series of articles in which he claimed Bhopal was about to be annihilated and begged the region's chief minister, unsuccessfully, to investigate the factory before it became Hitler's gas chamber. On the night of the 2nd of December 1984, following an explosive reaction with water, a deadly stream of gas began to seep out of the plant's MIC tank as all 6 safety systems designed to contain such a leak failed. At around 1 a.m. December 3, loud rumbling reverberated around the plant as a safety valve gave way, sending a plume of MIC gas into the early morning air. The world's worst industrial disaster had begun. By morning, human corpses were scattered across the old city, along narrow alleyways and roadsides. The people of Bhopal were waking up in agony. No one quite knew what was happening, just that they should run in whatever clothes they were wearing. People were gasping for air, vomiting uncontrollably, frothing at the mouth, and losing control of their bowels. Suffering visual impairment, many were rubbing their eyes with sewage water to ease the searing pain. Not even the unborn were spared. Over half of all pregnant women caught up in the commotion suffered spontaneous abortions. An Indian doctor on the scene famously stated, "Tonight, the Bhopalese are going through their own Hiroshima." The deadly gas used in the First World War seeped quietly through the city, affecting all in its path, wreaking havoc on the unsuspecting community.
Phosgene attacks primarily the lungs. It was classified in the First World War as a lung injurant. It would have a very, very similar action to methyl isocyanate. It would cause interference with gas exchange at the surface of the lung, the alveolar lining. And what used to happen sometimes in the First World War is that soldiers would be exposed. They'd seem to be perfectly all right. Then a few hours later, they'd have difficulty with breathing. They'd froth at the mouth, they'd turn blue, and they'd fall down, and quite quickly they'd be dead.
An estimated 3,800 people died immediately, mostly in the poor slum colony adjacent to the UCC plant. Local hospitals were soon overrun with the injured, a crisis further compounded by limited resources, a lack of knowledge of exactly what gases were involved and what its effects were.
The main thing is that it's extremely irritant. In fact, it reacts with water, so that when it hits any wet part of the body, the eyes or the mouth, it will cause irritation. Tremendous watering, burning feeling, and eventually you'll have ulceration and possibly thickening of the cornea, and it could even become opaque. One of the main things is to prevent infection, because once a damaged eye gets infected, well then the damage can get rapidly worse. Some people will get such severe damage and may get infection which could lead to blindness, but one would hope that most of these people will recover.
India's largest mosque, Tajul, situated in Bhopal, was smothered with people blinded and choking, trying to reach the hospital located behind it, which astonishingly treated 80,000 people in the first few days of the leakage. For the injured, the real fear was permanent loss of sight from the toxic cloud that covered the town. Bewildered junior doctors had no idea what treatments to administer. Poor resources and no proper treatment protocols. But amazingly, not one person in Bhopal suffered permanent blindness.
We never said they will lose permanently, but the fear was that this gas produces conjunctivitis and corneal ulceration, and when the ulcer heals, it can give rise to some corneal opacity and partial impairment of vision. But as we are seeing now so far, not a single case with total blindness has been reported to us. It's a little early. In course of time, we may have some cases who may have some partial impairment because of the corneal opacity. Well, that can still be corrected by corneal transplant. The number of cases are few. But I think we are quite happy to find that not a single case of total blindness has so far come to our knowledge.
Not a single case of total blindness was reported at the time, but estimates of the number of people killed in the first few days were staggering, running as high as 10,000, with the poison taking its heaviest toll on the very young. Secondary infections and difficulty with diagnosis and treatment further added to the crisis.
Many people will die now of secondary infections. Those who are not dead now may have pneumonia, develop pneumonia, because their whole respiratory system will be affected, and it may be a long time before, maybe a couple of months. Though there may not be any gas now, but the after effects will continue. It's something like a wound in your body. Deeper the wound, longer it takes to heal. In the meanwhile, your exposed surface is subject to infection. Same thing happens in the lung with this kind of gases also.
10,000 to 20,000 premature deaths reportedly occurred in the subsequent 2 decades, and hundreds of thousands were affected long term. Immediately after the disaster, UCC began attempts to disassociate itself from responsibility for the gas leak. This was the beginning of one of the longest-running prosecutions in India's history. Around the town, anger and fear was on the rise in days following the disaster. Hordes of people attempted to leave their homes, still confused by what had happened, in fear of another gas leak, and knowing that the lingering deadly gas was still in the air. The people of Bhopal were left distressed and disgusted as the cleanup began. Bhopal was like a city without its people the day after the tragedy. Marketplaces and shopping centres, normally thronging with crowds. Instead, the shops were shut and locked, deserted by its customers. This was all due to the people fleeing the city, as the operation to remove the remaining liquid from the town was to begin. Around the plant, bamboo and sackcloth fences were erected and soaked in water, in the hope that any escaping gas would be neutralised. Before the disaster, few people outside India had heard of Bhopal, the tranquil capital of Madhya Pradesh, built around a beautiful dam. It took only hours to poison this peaceful place, which the world now recalls as the City of the Damned. Deadly industrial disaster has occurred in other parts of the world, devastating communities and towns. The San Juanico industrial disaster was caused by a massive series of explosions at a liquid petroleum gas tank farm outside of Mexico City on November 19, 1984. The explosions destroyed the facility and devastated the local town, with 500 to 600 people killed and 5,000 to 7,000 others suffering severe burns. Another example occurred in 1976 in a small chemical manufacturing plant north of Milan in Seveso, Italy. The safety operations handled by the company's directors and local government were badly coordinated and to some extent incompetent. At least a week passed before it was publicly stated that dioxin had been admitted, and another week passed before evacuation began. Controversy surrounded the disposal of the waste at the time, and it wasn't until 9 years after the incident that the 42 barrels of toxic waste were incinerated. The 3 Mile Island accident was a partial core meltdown of the 3 Mile Island nuclear generating station in Dauphin County, Pennsylvania. The accident began at 4 a.m. on Wednesday, March 28, 1979, resulting in large amounts of nuclear reactor coolant to escape. The UK also has its own history of industrial disasters. June 2, 1974, an explosion at a chemical plant close to the village of Flicksborough killed 28 people and seriously injured 36. The cloud, on coming in contact with an ignition source, exploded, completely destroying the plant. Around 1,800 buildings within a mile radius of the site were damaged. Bhopal may seem healed on the surface, but beneath there is still misery, bitterness, and a host of unanswered questions. Many families still suffer. Wives who lost their husbands struggle to earn a living to feed their children. The men who survived as labourers of Union Carbide are without work. Those wounded live their lives with pain and in need of ongoing medical support that they cannot afford. Bitterness directed at Union Carbide and the government remains. At the time, the government promised to award £130 to each affected individual, but legal tangles ensued and that figure dropped, with many not receiving their entitlement. The moral responsibility was clear, but compensation for the many workers and victims was not forthcoming. Bhopal Union sent members to America and Britain to drum up support in the aftermath. With no question, they wanted Union Carbide out of their city.
We are of the firm view it was the responsibility of the Union Carbide, and they have committed a heinous crime on population. In the industrial history, nowhere such a major disaster had taken place. And the responsibility should be fully owned by Union Carbide, and Union Carbide had no moral right to exist. They should pack up their whole business and give the money to the victims.
Outside the hospitals in Bhopal, the queues continued in the months after the accident. New cases were presenting every day, and doctors were expecting the health issues to continue for many, many years to come. The plight of doctors was not aided, as scientists at the time said there was a total lack of information coming from Union Carbide.
The Union Carbide has not been able to provide us any
any such information which would be of help in the clinical management of these patients. And the scientific and the other data also is not available to that extent. They did send some information following the visit of one or two of their scientists, but that information we have not been able to find of much help in the clinical management of these patients.
The greatest controversy at the time was whether to administer the drug sodium bisulfite, an antidote for cyanide poisoning. Union Carbide maintain it was MIC gas that leaked from the factory, not cyanide, which is carried in the blood and has long-term effects. Far more remains to be done for public health in the context of industrialisation to show that the lessons of the countless thousands dead in Bhopal have truly been learned. Bhopal and its aftermath were a warning that the path to industrialisation for developing countries in general, and India in particular, is fraught with human, environmental and economic perils.
I personally feel that as a hindsight, a lot of things could have been done better. But, for instance, the healthcare, for instance, the payment of early compensation, the rehabilitation program, all that.
Diana, Princess of Wales, lived a fabled life, a princess of determined splendour, yet one who bore testimony to the commonality of the everyday person. It would be Diana's story, including her struggles and circumstances surrounding her tragic death, we remember as the key event of the 90s. With her loss went the hopes of a world that had turned her life into part of its own projected biography, a fragile hope for a happy ever after, even in the face of adversity. On August 31st, 1997, Diana, Princess of Wales, died after the black Mercedes in which she was a passenger crashed in a 4-lane underpass at Place d'Alma in Paris. When Diana's death was announced, the world was shocked. The United Kingdom was gripped by an unprecedented outpouring of public grief, and millions around the world shared the feeling of loss. Diana earned a place in hearts around the world with her compassion for those in pain, suffering and grief. Not only was this a tragic end for the woman adored by millions, but the world's collective mourning was a global event like no other. Diana, Princess of Wales, truly was the people's princess, the queen of their hearts. To understand the gravity surrounding Diana's death, one must seek to understand Diana's story from the very beginning, including her struggles, triumphs, and the enormous courage she displayed throughout her life in the face of adversity. In 1961, Diana was born into the aristocratic Spencer family. Her family had ties with the Windsors, and as a young girl she enjoyed the company of Prince Charles's brothers Andrew and Edward. At only 6 years old, Diana endured the divorce of her parents, and later when her father remarried, she found that she did not take well to her stepmother. Diana was sent to Riddlesworth Hall boarding school at 8 years old, but she struggled with her schoolwork and homesickness. She later moved to West Heath in Kent, where she excelled in sports, particularly in the swimming pool, and was actively involved in charity work. Although Diana struggled academically, failing all of her O-levels, she was able to joke about it 10 years later, when she revisited West Heath.
My years at West Heath were certainly very happy ones indeed. I made many friends who I often see, and in spite of what Miss Rudge and my other teachers may have thought at the time, I did actually learn something. Though you would never have known by my O-level results.
Exams, homework and arithmetic may not have been Diana's strong point, but at the age of 16, she attended finishing school in Switzerland. Diana had by now inherited the title of Lady Diana Spencer. However, she was essentially a very ordinary young woman. She moved into a flat with friends in London and worked as a nanny and kindergarten teacher. This seemingly ordinary life, however, was all about to change. In 1980, at 18 years of age, Diana joined the royal family for a weekend hunt at Sandringham, invited by mutual friends. Diana's flatmates joked that perhaps she would become the Queen of England, but Diana modestly brushed them off. A string of requests from Charles followed over the next 6 months. The tabloids pursued Diana as the main romantic interest of Charles.
Is there any possibility of any announcement of your marriage in the near future? Can you tell me? Can you tell me if there's any possibility?
I'm not going to say anything, I'm afraid.
Right, but Prince Charles did give us a hint himself. He said we wouldn't have to wait too long.
In February 1981, the wait was over. Buckingham Palace announced that Prince Charles and Lady Diana were engaged. Diana, who was not yet 20 years old, was infatuated with her new fiancé. She stated that as long as he was by her side, she could do anything.
Yesterday you were a nanny looking after children. Now you're about to marry the Prince of Wales, and one day you would, in all likelihood, be Queen. It's a tremendous change for someone, I may say, of 19 to make all of a sudden, the transition.
It is, but I've had a small run-up to it all in the last 6 months. And next to Prince Charles and I can't go wrong. He's there with me.
On July 29, 1981, the wedding of the century had finally arrived. People took to the streets in celebration, as this day had been declared a public holiday.
Very well, thank you. I'd just like to say a word. May I say a word?
Please do.
Yes. The Spencers have, through the centuries, fought for their king and country. Today, Diana is vying to help her country for the rest of her life.
Lady Diana's mother, Mrs. Shankard, had flown from her home in Australia to attend the ceremony. At Buckingham Palace, the Queen and Prince Philip set off in the procession bound for St. Paul's Cathedral. Prince Charles was accompanied by his brother Andrew. Lady Diana, at just 20 years of age, emerged from Clarence House, ready to become the future Queen of England. Diana's silk wedding dress has since become iconic in fashion history. The royal couple honeymooned on a yacht, but perhaps as a taste of what was to come, the princess wasn't entirely satisfied. Engaged on official duties and bound to a husband who had brought his fishing gear and books along to his honeymoon, the princess's fairy tale wedding did not necessarily translate into a fairy tale honeymoon.
Madam, how are you enjoying married life?
Highly recommend it.
On the 21st of June 1982, Diana fulfilled one of her most important princess duties. She gave birth to Prince William Arthur Philip Louis. However, Diana later stated that she had had a difficult pregnancy and suffered postnatal depression. The princess spoke of waking up in the mornings and not wanting to get out of bed. In public, however, the royal couple still appeared happy. They soon conceived a second child, and on the 15th of September 1984, Prince Henry Charles Albert David arrived a week earlier than expected. Diana had endured a 9-hour labour, during which she refused to take drugs and sucked on an ice cube to prevent dehydration during the delivery. Diana's common touch and ability to relate to all kinds extended to her own family, making a lasting impression on her children. As a mother, she desired that William, along with his younger brother, have normal experiences that other royal children had not had until later in life, if at all. Profound life lessons such as taking both boys to locales that range from Disney World and McDonald's to AIDS clinics and shelters for the homeless. She also brought them things typical teenagers used, like video games.
My brother and I were lucky enough to grow up supported by the love and nurturing of our family. They saw to our education, our health, our well-being, and every other need.
Diana's relationship with the press was complicated, at times courted. No member of the royal family has captured the attention of the press and the heart of the public more than Princess Diana. Even before her engagement to Prince Charles, Diana became a press obsession. Then came the fairy tale wedding, the altruistic charity work, the fashionable attire, and the very public divorce. A photo opportunity would push paper sales through the roof. A shroud of guilt still exists today, that the public's desire for her was so strong that it set birds of prey to stalk her, the paparazzi.
I was not aware of how overwhelming that attention would become, nor the extent to which it would affect both my public duties and my personal life in a manner that's been hard to bear. My first priority will continue to be our children, William and Harry, who deserve as much love and care and attention as I am able to give, as well as an appreciation of the tradition into which they were born.
In a sad, ironic twist of fate, it was Diana's very attempt to escape the press which ultimately led to her death. The end began in the Mediterranean, and it began as it was to end. Princess Diana, ex-wife of the heir to the British throne and Dodi Al Fayed, eldest son of the millionaire businessman, had intended finishing their summer holiday on Sardinia. This morning they found themselves again being pestered by the paparazzi, so they returned to Paris for a last evening together before the princess flew back to England. The paparazzi kept up the hunt and stalked the glamorous couple throughout the evening, right up until Diana's driver desperately attempted to escape the stalking photographers. There was little sound for the first 2 minutes after the crash, except for the hoarse wail of the mangled car's horn. Witnesses walking near the mouth of the tunnel saw the car enter at high speed, pursued by a swarm of motorcycles and scooters, and heard what sounded to them like an explosion. The chauffeur was killed instantly, slumped over the wheel, the weight of his body pressing the dead car's horn. In front of the wreck, a paparazzo raised his camera and began to snap. The 2 survivors were rushed by ambulance to a public hospital. On the way, paramedics examined the wounded princess and found her condition grave. She was suffering from extensive chest injuries, a massive wound to the left lung, and numerous broken bones. Her blood pressure barely registered on the rescue team's instruments. At 3:57 a.m. on August 31st, 1997, in Paris, Lady Diana Frances Spencer, the Princess of Wales, was pronounced dead. Words could not express the shock and grief felt by the world. People who had only ever seen pictures of Diana in a magazine, watched her on television, or read about her in books and newspapers, felt as though they had lost a true friend. Over 1 million bunches of flowers were laid at Kensington Palace. 6 million people lined the streets to pay their respects. 2.5 billion people watched the procession on television. But for all of those people who had never even met Diana, there were 2 boys who had lost someone who meant more to them than we could ever imagine. Diana's sons, Princess William and Harry, aged only 15 and 12, trailed behind their mother's coffin. In a eulogy given by Diana's brother, Charles Spencer asked the crowd to pledge that they would protect William and Harry from a similar fate, and that they would continue to raise the boys in the imaginative, free and joyful way Diana had begun. The circumstance surrounding the accident and subsequent death of Diana, Princess of Wales, spawned a media frenzy. Speculation was rife and the public's appetite for information was insatiable. Although the initial French investigation found that Diana, Princess of Wales, had died as a result of an accident, the conspiracy theories persistently raised by Dodi's father, Mohammed Al-Fayed, and the Daily Express suggested that she was assassinated.
I believe that my son and Princess Diana have been murdered by the royal family.
The French investigation concluded that the accident was caused by Henri Paul's drunken loss of control. From February 1999, Mohammed Al-Fayed maintained that the crash had been planned. Inquests in London during 2004 and 2007 finally attributed the accident to grossly negligent driving by Henri Paul and the pursuing paparazzi. The following day, Al-Fayed announced he would end his 10-year campaign for the sake of the late Princess of Wales' children.
I think it's time to draw a line. I think the Princes William and Harry have spoken for the whole country when they say this is time to bring this to an end.
With that, there was an official end to the Diana inquest, but there was no end to the legacy of charity, goodwill and hope that she left the world. Diana's charity work endeared her to the public, raising issues such as AIDS and homelessness. The princess was most publicly noted for her charity work and stance against landmines. Photos of Diana walking through a minefield wearing a ballistic helmet and flak jacket brought a great deal of publicity to the issue. Perhaps her most inspiring work was when she became the first high-profile person to knowingly touch people with the HIV virus.
HIV does not make people dangerous to know, so you can shake their hands and give them a hug. Heaven knows they need it.
Drug and alcohol abuse was another of her main concerns, and she often spoke her mind about the subjects.
As far as prevention is concerned, parents and teachers are in the front line. As a parent myself, I'm only too aware of the responsibility this implies.
In the last year of her life, Diana supported many charities, compared often to Mother Teresa, who ironically passed away the day before the princess. Humanitarian work was her life, her passion, her gift to humanity, and her legacy to the world. The Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund was established after her death, with its mission to continue Diana's humanitarian work in the United Kingdom and overseas. Diana had a very personable touch. She was very at ease in meeting people from any background, and even if they were ill or in hospices. The patients would react very favourably to her meetings. They warmed to her life energy and heartfelt sympathy. She could empathise with people suffering, having suffered much herself. To the media, Diana often portrayed a very stoic and positive energy, but an aide suggested that at the same time these engagements often drained Diana emotionally. At the end of some, she felt depleted. Diana's legacy also lives on in the hearts of her sons, William and Harry. Emotionally affected by the media's influence on his parents' divorce and his mother's tragic death, William has publicly stated his dislike for the press and seems uncomfortable with the growing attention he receives. William gives the impression of being a well-mannered, responsible and mature young man who shows a strong sense of duty and loyalty to the royal family, fully aware of the role he is to play in the future as the King of England. Along with his military career, William supports numerous charities. Younger brother Harry is third in line to the English throne, and since birth he has grown up in the media spotlight. Diana once described Prince Harry as a very artistic and sporty boy. Diana ensured that both boys enjoyed a normal childhood, despite the family's privileged position in British society. At an early age, Harry may have discovered his future career with a keen interest in all things military. Despite his parents' increasingly strained marriage, he became known for his happy-go-lucky disposition as a child. After his mother's death, Harry grew to be a typically rebellious teenager. On more than one occasion, he has attracted the attention of the tabloid press for alleged drug use, reckless behaviour at sporting events and scuffles with paparazzi. Suffice to say, he has not had a happy relationship with the media. After completing his A-levels, Prince Harry took a gap year during which he visited Australia, Argentina and Africa, where he made a documentary about the plight of orphans in Lesotho.
But when it comes to kids, I love kids. And it's something about African kids that are just even more special. They're so underprivileged, yet, you know, anything you give them, any little present, whatever it is, they will be so appreciative about it. They'll think it's Christmas.
During this period, Prince Harry co-founded the charity Saint Bail with Prince Césaire of Lesotho in memory of their mothers. This charity supports orphans and vulnerable children in Lesotho. Almost a decade after their mother's death, William and Harry teamed up to organise a memorial concert for Diana. Waving their arms in the air with 70,000 fans at Wembley Stadium, Princess William and Harry celebrated the life of their mother, Princess Diana, on what would have been her 46th birthday. Around 15 million people in the UK watched the concert for Diana on television, and it was broadcast to 140 countries around the world. The concert for Diana was a huge success and testament to her loving legacy, which remains so strong to this day. For many of us, the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, would be a marker in our lives forever. A day when the world seemed to stop, an event that changed the world we live in. Diana may be gone, but her memory lives on.
too late.